Richard Stallman's The Greek Alexander Romance, the author essentially explains to us that Alexander was a hero and still is today. To quote Stoneman, the longevity of the name of Alexander over 2 millennia and the unimportance of historical fact for the endurance of a great name kind of sums it up. Alexander was a hero to many people by the time of his death in 323 BCE, but his legend grew significantly in the 600 years following his death. As Stoneman points out, his popularity in the 3rd century AD coincides with a period when there was a considerable interest in the life of sages, holy men, and wonder workers, and a flourishing literature developed around these subjects. In other words, people of this era liked the idea of heroes who could just do miraculous things, and Alexander was certainly capable of this. And this book is evidence that, and evidence of how over hundreds of years his legend only grew and became more spectacular as time went on. His legend as a hero also evolved depending upon the political or religious beliefs of those who interpreted his life. For example, Egyptian, Persian, or Greek writers would add their own personal interest in describing the life of Alexander, while Christian and Jewish writers would add their own bias. For Jews, he was a preacher and a prophet. To Christians, he obeyed God before all else. It may never have been their intent to deceive future readers. It was probably more likely that they just wanted to make the story relevant to their own feelings, thoughts, and their own era. And when a story is translated into different languages again and again over hundreds of years, the legend just gets more and more fantastic with each retelling of the story. As Stoneman says in describing the Alexander Romance, the best analogy is not with literature, but with film. And I completely agree with this. After reading the book, I'd say it's far more Hollywood than nonfiction. Alexander seems to fit many facets of what it means to be a hero that we've discussed in class in the Alexander Romance. Even a tragic hero. Like Oedipus, he unknowingly kills his father, Nectembo, by pushing him into a pit. This too was unavoidable because it happened because of fate. His motivation is quite unclear, but as Nectembo lays there dying, he utters, I myself have read my own fate, that I was doomed to be destroyed by my own child, and I have not escaped my own fate, because I have been killed by you. To which Alexander responds, Oh, I am your son then? Again, like a Hollywood film, Nectembo breathes his last breaths as he explains to him the truth of his paternity. Nectembo actually disguised himself as the god Ammon to sleep with Olympia, and which is Alexander's mother. So in this book, Philip is not his dad, or is not his paternal dad. He's just the man who raised him. But in the book, Alexander was destined to be a king even from his youth. As a child, he was said to be the shape of a man. His hair was that of a lion, and his teeth were as sharp as nails, while his movements were as swift and as violent as a lion. I don't know anyone who's described adolescence like that, but Alexander somehow manages to do that. Like our class's description of a modern hero, Alexander was brilliant and selfless. As a young student, he used to draw up fellow students in ranks for war and send them into battle. But whenever he saw one side losing to the other, he took the losing side and helped them until they were winning again. So he could do nothing wrong, basically. It is historically true that Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander. However, in the Greek Alexander Romance, Alexander manages to teach Aristotle, at least in certain moments. Alexander is in a class with the sons of several kings. And one day in class, Aristotle asks everyone, if you inherit your kingdom from your father, what will you do for me, basically? And other kids give mediocre answers, but Alexander challenges, one of the smartest men of the time by questioning him and saying, you're asking me about the future. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. I also see that as sort of a mediocre answer, but Aristotle sees this ingenious or you could say, hero of the mind, and rewards Alexander by telling him and foreshadowing that he's going to be the greatest rule the world has ever seen, and the greatest king ever. As any hero, Alexander has great courage. While it has actually, again, been agreed upon by scholars that he did in fact tame Bucephalus, his horse, in this text, it's just so hyperbolized. Alexander approaches Bucephalus' cage. It is not just the horse in the cage. The cage is filled with pieces of dismembered human corpses lying around. It turns out this is a man-eating horse. Upon seeing Alexander, though, the horse stretches out his forefeet towards Alexander and then just licks him on the face. And acknowledging him as his own master. That's what the book says. Alexander opens the cage, grabs the horse by his mane, leaps 6 feet in the air atop the horse, and rides him into the middle of Petta. Philip, upon hearing this, shouts, Alexander will be the ruler of the world. You know, again, foreshadowing. It seems like heroes are also always in the right place at the right time, and of course, are saviors and on the right side of history. An example of this would be when Alexander has been gone for months. However, he happens to come home from war the exact moment Pausanias attempts to assassinate Philip and kidnap his mother, Olympias. While Pausanias does manage to stab his father, Philip does not die until Alexander, in a heroic fashion, stabs Pausanias with a lance and brings him to Philip so Philip can have the privilege of killing the offender himself. Of course, this is a hero also fulfilling fate, because later in the text it states that Alexander was destined to avenge his father's killer, to allow his father to die in peace. So as Philip lays there breathing his last breath, as epic as possible, as he's turning cold, he explains to Alexander that he's completely content with dying because of what Alexander has just done for him. Not only did he live a hero's life, he certainly dies one of the most epic hero's death in the Greek Alexander romance. I mean, his death is avenged too, Alexander's, but this time by his own horse. And this is one of the craziest things I've ever read in my life. So there's a slave who poisoned Alexander, and the slave comes into the room Alexander's dying in to check if Alexander's dead. And the horse, just upon seeing this slave, starts neighing and freaking out, and he runs over, grabs the slave, and starts shaking him on the ground violently to show everyone that this is the perpetrator. He then takes a great leap into the air, dragging the slave around, and smashes him into the ground. Not only does this man fall apart, bits of him fly all over the room like snow falling off a roof in the wind. This horse is just really powerful. While Alexander fulfills many of the behaviors of that of a hero, I would say the defining characteristic that differs from this book and many of the concepts, what we've talked about to be a hero in class, is that Alexander's never ending urge for further exploration. What made him a hero is not only who he is, but where he had been. A hero is someone who discovers the uncharted and does so without fear or hesitation. Over his seemingly never ending travels in the Greek Alexander romance, Alexander encounters dog headed men, men without heads, men with 6 hands, goats with lions' heads, this Indian altar that's made completely of gold and emeralds. And only when he travels to the ends of the world where everything is dark and there's no sun for days on end does he realize that he's been far enough and he's satisfied with his travels. Literally the end of the world is what only when he's satisfied and allows himself to turn around and head back to civilization.